Well, hey everyone, welcome to ChurchPulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here, and I'm joined as always by David Kinnaman from the Barna Group. Good to see you, David.
Hey, Carey, how's it going? Good to see you.
It's going great. It's going great. I'm excited that we're in the middle of our Making Space series with the Aspen Group. So you've done work with them over the years, and you think we're finally at the point where people can start thinking about the future again and how we'll redesign our buildings and all that stuff?
I think we're definitely at that point because the future is happening right around us, isn't it? And I think there's still some lingering questions around what's going to stay, what's going to change. But certainly, we're in an era of great change. And our friends at Aspen Group have been they've been friends with me personally for a long time. I've gotten to speak at some of their conferences, and we did this, I think, very innovative study a number of years ago called "Making Space for Millennials." And they've been wonderful partners. It actually all started when I brought my Lego sets to one of their meetings. I would have been an architect. I would have been an architect, I think, if I wasn't a pastor. And if I wasn't a pastor, I would be a social researcher. So here we are. Architect would have been fun, but I sort of play out that fantasy by building architectural Lego, and I just thought it would be fun we were doing some consulting with these guys and doing some research, and I brought some of my Lego to one of the meetings, and that's where the partnership began. I think the plastic engendered the affinity.
It's funny, we touched on this a little bit, but it's amazing how much space in design has really become part of mainstream culture. I don't remember as a kid seeing adults quite as concerned about design and even being a 20-something myself. I mean, you knew if a building was ugly or if a building was nice, but it was like you put up with a lot of beige and a lot of boxes. And then design really went through a kind of renaissance now. And I think it's important, particularly as and as we've talked about, or we'll talk about again during this series, space is formative. It's theological. And so I think for all those reasons, it's a good conversation. By the way, if you want copies of some stuff that they're giving away, I think they're giving away my book, At Your Best. You can go to aspengroup.com/churchpulse and learn a lot more about how you can rethink your space there while you're at it as well. So we're going to talk to Joe Saxton today, or I guess I am. But you've got some data that you want to share with us as leaders today, David. We're going to be drilling down on space, relationship, and even loneliness.
Yeah. So one of the things we learned in our research was that 3 in 5 church-going millennials said that they had stayed connected to people in the church over the past year. That was right during the sort of the height of the pandemic, or a year into the pandemic. And that was actually higher by a decent stretch than boomers, for whom less than half said that was the case. So I think this is an interesting argument that digital church can actually be a very relationally oriented space, especially for those who are more digitally native. Another factor that we saw in the research was that 4 out of 5 churched Christians, at 80%, said they would be interested if Christian churches in their community offered preaching and programs around relational well-being. And nearly half of unchurched people in our country said that they'd also be interested in that. And this, again, speaks to this larger theme we've been talking about for a while on Church Pulse Weekly, that people are looking for the church to show up, not just on the Sunday aspects of life, sort of the sort of the spirituality and the things that are all about, sort of life of the spirit and the heart, but actually around relationships, vocation, financial well-being, mental well-being. And so relationships are, continuing to be such a critical part of what it means for us to minister with effectiveness today.
Yeah, and if anybody should be able to do relationships well, it should be the church. I seem to remember something about loving God, loving your neighbor, loving yourself, and nobody should be able to out-local or out-relationship the local church. And it's interesting that almost half of all unchurched people say, yeah, if the church did that, I would be curious to learn more.
Yeah, and we're very specific in the language. Would you be interested if Christian churches in your area offered preaching and programs? That's I think a really good indicator that people would be open to the kinds of things that we're doing already naturally, but to recognize that relationships coming out of the pandemic and relational connectedness, set against the backdrop of loneliness. One of my colleagues here at Barna is just releasing a book called the Loneliness Epidemic, and we know that just massive numbers of people over the last number of decades have been experiencing loneliness. That trend is only growing during the pandemic. So while some people are leaning into their relationships during the pandemic, many others are experiencing deep loneliness and isolation. Obviously, we're out of most of the heavy quarantine, but it sort of revealed who our real friends were and maybe how we were more isolated than we thought we were, even though in many ways the church should be, as you say, the place where we have deeper connections than we could possibly imagine.
So there's another statistic about how women and men felt about digital church relationally during the pandemic. What did we learn there?
Well, when we interviewed churchgoers, women were significantly less likely than men to agree that they feel connected to their church community when they attend church digitally. 63% of women versus 70% of men among churchgoers who had attended church digitally said that. So, the difference isn't massive, but it's a decent difference where women are getting less out of digital church than the men are in our surveys. And again, I think this just reminds us that we have to pay attention to the fact that our ministry hits a lot of different people. I mean, we're talking about the issue of gender with that, but ethnicity plays a role, income status, generation, sort of phase of life or what you're going through. And I think this is just a good reminder for us as leaders that, your ministry can never be one size fits all because it's hitting a lot of different people at a lot of different times in a lot of different ways. And even though you can't, sort of mass produce an experience, there has to be some sensitivity to the fact that different kinds of people are experiencing different kinds of outcomes. And again, it's just a reminder that women are experiencing something very different in digital church than perhaps the men are who are tuning in.
Well, that's good to know. So why don't we bring Jo Saxton in? She is an author, speaker, podcast host, and leadership coach. She has dedicated her career to growing leadership teams around the world and empowering women to find their purpose in their personal lives and in leadership. Her latest book is Ready to Rise, Own Your Voice, Gather Your Community, and Step into Your Influence. Let's welcome Jo. Well, I'm excited to have Jo Saxton with us today. Welcome back.
Why, good to see you, Carey. Good to be back.
So we're pushing 2 years, which is crazy in this whole weird world that you and I now live in and all the pastors who are listening to the show live in. I'd love to start here. What does it look like to foster meaningful relationships in an increasingly digital age for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I suspect, Carey, you might not be that dissimilar from me. I have a number of meaningful relationships with people in different countries. Mm-hmm. And I have found a lot more of my relationships are like that now. So I have a brother in Hong Kong. Most of my family is still in England, and then friends in other parts of the world. And so the digital world was a gift really early on for us. Whether it was Zoom or WhatsApp or whatever, the digital world we approached it as not as a loss, but as the sustainer of our relationships. Right. And I think that in itself, because we weren't forced to do it, actually helped the focus of it. But I think what it has meant has been within my family and my friendship group, it's become a lifeline. And it's looked like making sure there are regular ways and embracing the weirdness, embracing it is weird. It's not like a living room, but how can we build out this space in a way that it's as meaningful, as authentic, as honest as it would be as if we were in a room together? And I think because my family are overseas, we've had to do that.
So what's happened, because we've all been through what we've been through over the last couple of years, just on a personal note, what's happened to your relationships? Ministry relationships, congregational relationships, friendship relationships, as we've been in and out of lockdown over the last few years. So both close, those relationships that are close to you, where normally you would be, hey, let's go for coffee, let's have dinner. And obviously a lot of that is back now, but it still feels a bit wonky. And then those that are far away, what's that been like for you personally, Jo?
Yeah, it's been weird. It's been weird. Yeah. I like for everybody, I think for those far away, it's been weird and fun in terms of we've tried things like we've done card games with the family or different kinds of games with the family for a while. And then after a while, we're like, yeah, we're done. We'll just. Yeah,
exactly. We played Settlers of Catan online a couple of times, and then it's like, oh, we'll just wait until we can see each other.
Totally. It's like, it's good. And it was like novel. It became novel for a while. And it was good because, grandparents want to see grandkids, nephews and nieces. I have a niece that I've not met in person yet. I've only met her online. And so on that level, it's better than nothing. I think they have become spaces. When I think of my closest friends, they have been spaces where we have just kind of been tired together, honestly. Like where we've sat and not worked, but sat and just chatted and said, okay, we'll all bring a snack, and it's weird, but we'll carry on. And it's been okay. For the closer ones, I think it has been odd because you can't go for a coffee. I think the immediacy and the habits, the kind of let's get together and do this. And in Minnesota, we were able to walk outside. So there's been a lot of walks, lots of getting out into nature. That has been a big feature. For my husband and I, instead of date nights, it's walk days because there are no restaurants, or at least for the times when the restaurants were takeout.
During lockdown,
everything was walking. And so I think there was a greater appreciation for that. But I think when I think of the last couple of years, the overriding sense has just been the trying to connect through the tiredness and trying to connect when you're tired of connecting digitally. Has been a discipline, has been the need to connect has kind of gone harder than I guess the conversation. We're not talking about movies we've seen in the same way. We're not talking about things we've done in the same way. So the texture of the conversation, I think, has been the biggest thing because no one's gone anywhere to say where they've gone.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, my favorite definition of intimacy, I think it comes from either John Ortberg or Dallas Willard, is intimacy is shared experiences, right? And again, when you're just talking about things that happen in your own life and you haven't got a common narrative, and experiences. We just got back from a retreat with my team last week. It's the first time some of my team has met, hired some of them during the pandemic. So it was really cool. But like we went sailing on the ocean together and we rented this amazing Airbnb in Kennebunkport. It was like, I don't know, 5,000, 7,000 square feet. Like we'll always have that. And as much as we've used Zoom for years as a company, et cetera, there's something about being physically gathered that changes. I was talking to my assistant today. It's first day back for us as we record it. And she's like, you know what? Even in the Slack messages now, because we have been together, it feels like I actually know these people, even though she's been with us for 7 years. There is something about physical that digital doesn't quite capture.
Absolutely. I had the same experience in terms of onboarding some team during the pandemic and then meeting them a couple of them for the first time just a month ago. And it was even simple things like your height.
Yeah, exactly. Like how tall are you, right?
How tall are you? Because right now, all I know of you is this. Or, I mean, when I recognize you if I go like this. When I take it out, all bets are off kind of thing. I can't see the square that surrounds your face anymore. And so you're right. There is a different, I think I'm far more appreciative, to be honest. I'm far more appreciative of the physical space at church, going in to worship for the first time after a year or so online. I love doing stuff online, but there's something about seeing people's faces and the physicality that is an integral part of our spirituality. That is an integral part of our relationship building. And so I agree with you. You can't, the digital thing, there is reams of things you can do, but there's something distinct and unique about what you do when you're in the same physical space.
So let's ask the $1 million question then, because of course you're going to have the answer to this, Joe. All right, but
yeah, of course. Why, thank you.
the question that everybody's asking, and there are different views of opinions on this: can you do discipleship digitally? What's your take on that?
I actually think you can. I think you can, but because I think you do when you have to. I think you can, if you can talk about authenticity, if you can share some life space, I think there's something you can do. Do I think that it's a replacement? No, but I think it can go a lot. I do believe it can go a long way, partly because we had to beforehand. And I'm sure you have had the same experience of investing in leaders, training in leaders, talking through faith and life and building a meaningful relationship with somebody. I think where it's missing, I do think you can, but I think there are gaps. The gap I would say is the understanding of discipleship is, in the Greek, it's mathetes, and it's that student, the apprentice. How do you apprentice someone digitally? I think, can you do the exchange of information, the authentic shared life piece, the vulnerability? I do believe you can. Can you do the apprenticing when someone's learning from your example because they're seeing you live your life? That's where I think it gets weaker.
No, it's a really good point. And you raised a distinction I just want to highlight. And I think I agree with you on that, Joe. It's not a replacement. Like, I guess if you live in an environment where you can't possibly get together with anyone physically, then digital's a good replacement. But most people don't live there. Like, we launched our online campus for our church 5.5 years ago. And I wrote the theology of our online church at that time at Connexus. And I always said, this is what we told people who even joined us in the early days of digital church, is an A+ online experience is inferior to a C+ in-person experience. And what we encouraged people to do was, as much as you might think this is a great online church, I love it, this is my church, we want you to connect with a local church. And if you're in a small community, that church may not have a great band. You may not prefer the preaching as much, but we think the community of being together with people life on life is going to be better than simply having a digital substitute for what you're doing. Now, that said, digital is the front door. Digital is also the side door for, if you're away for the weekend, like I did digital church yesterday after weeks of in-person. Why? Because my wife was recovering from a cold and I have an infection on this, bike crash accident I had. So it wasn't good for me to be out in public. I'm really grateful for digital church. But I also, having been back now for a couple of months, I'm like, oh, it would have been fun to be in the room. It was full. My friend Mark was preaching. He did a great job, all that stuff. What is it about physical space that, think about church, not just life and being in the woods and that kind of stuff or in people's homes, but how do physical spaces help us feel connected with others, in your view?
I mean, I think partly when you look around a room, you are reminded that your faith is not just this individualistic you and God thing, but there is a communal sense. You are a people. You're the people of God. You're not just the person of God. There is a community. You see different shapes and sizes, hopefully different ages, different generations, different ethnicities, or every tribe and tongue. You see a glimpse. You get to be part of that. I think there's something in our worship, worship is the most obvious one, whatever the style. And even the silence, there's something really powerful when there's a collective moment of silence, even in our worship. But there's something transcendent and something about the bigness of God that you have in a physical space. That's why cathedrals were built the way they were. That's why to testify about the greatness of God in some way. But when you're in a room with people, the stories are embodied. There is an embodied part of our spirituality in our design that we can't. That is wonderful to see. I love seeing it digitally. I love seeing a room, but like you say, you're on the outside looking in, and it's not. It's just not the same. You're observing it rather than participating in the experience together. But even that, I'm sure when your friend was speaking, there are the amens that you hear and that's good. And that's, do you know what I mean? The sense of even there's an interaction, depending on the nature of our preaching in our churches, which is a communal experience too, where there's call and response, where there's agreement, where there's a moment where people are shocked, or all those things physically build community. The joke you shared together, the laughter, hearing the laughter in the room, the awkward minute when somebody did something weird in the corner, all of that's part of your shared family of God experience.
Well, you said something really interesting too. I love connecting dots. And a friend of mine sent me an article today from The Atlantic, which I hadn't heard of, called "The Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart." Really
I read that one too.
Do you read that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it talks about the politicization of the church and the hyperpolarization of the church, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if the last year and a half of being left out of community, often not by choice, but increasingly by choice, the great percentage of people who have just disappeared from church, or the great percentage of people who are like, it's kind of optional now. I wonder do you think that there is a connection between our being disconnected physically and the polarization we're seeing in culture? What made me think of it is when you said, when you go into the church and you realize that church is people, it's not a person, right? Because I can get very selfish. It's very easy for me in my own little home to get very selfish about what I like and don't like. I'm just wondering whether there's a connection there. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's easy to dehumanize people if they're just opinions.
Right.
They're just opinions. You don't it's easy to make them a position rather than a person. It's easy to take them away from the fact that they are wives, daughters, brothers, sisters, colleagues, doctors, teachers, when it's just text. You can strip every part of their humanity, their image bearerness out of a statement. And I think it does make it easier then you don't have to get past your stuff. You don't have to have manners, apparently.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to have manners. You don't even have to be nice. You just have to have a position. But I tell you the other thing that I'm struck by, I was reading a while back on the impact of chronic loneliness. That late Professor John Cacioppo wrote, he did a TEDx talk about it, and he talks about the problem of chronic loneliness. And he says that it impacts your stress levels, but also your impulses, your ability to kind of handle your impulses. You're more desensitized in some way. And I think the chronic loneliness has actually made it harder in our functioning in relationships. And I think that adds to the polarization. I think when you're isolated in your position and you've just dug deep and you see that person, but you don't, I mean, you and I know as people of communicators that our words are just a simple part of that communication. Our body language speaks, our facial expression speaks, our gestures speak. We have taken all of that away in our physical living with one another. All of that's gone.
Oh, that's so good. When I think about chronic loneliness, it was a problem before the pandemic. It's an epidemic now. I mean, I think it was in maybe 4 or 5 years ago, England, the UK, appointed a minister for loneliness. It's like, this is such an issue for elderly people who are living alone, for singles who are living alone. And I mean, when we think about family. But I know our mutual friend Reggie Joyner has often talked about how the nuclear family, the way it's historically been defined, is now a minority of families when you really look at it. So people are lonely, people are isolated. And I wonder if that makes a distinction, Joe, between streaming, where I consume on my device all by myself on my time, and digital community, actually fostering groups where people meet and connection and dialogue, right? Because we online ministry is not a universal thing where it's like, oh yeah, by online ministry, we mean so many different things.
Absolutely.
What are some innovative ways you've seen churches try to bring about, or maybe the answer is, well, I haven't seen it, we need to invent it, but try to bring about online community, digital community? What are some best practices?
I mean, I think the things I have seen is when people have dedicated people along. So there may be the host at the gathering and the service and the space itself, but there's also the host of that online community, because then you're actually saying then, hey, you're not just looking in. I'm here with you. I'm here with you. And our church has like digital connect cards and hosts who host people throughout the entire experience of church, so that people are maybe on their own in their rooms, but they're not alone. I think the best practices have been whenever people kind of position maybe part of their team, part of their staff to actually say, here, I'm here to minister to you. I know you're not in the room. I know you're, for whatever reason, but I see you. I see your experience. I see that you're part of our family as well. So what's your prayer request? Let's make sure everybody gets that. What's your need? How are you doing today? And when there's a chat facility of some kind and a response to that chat, when it's not just chat that's scrolling up and up that people miss, but there are people interacting. I think that creates connection, doesn't it? It's not the same, but it's still significant.
Yeah. You're reminding me of a conversation I had with Alan George, who went ahead of a lot of us, being Life Church's online pastor for the last decade until recently. And, when Craig hired him, he came from the corporate world and then kids ministry. And Craig Rochelle, he said, well, how should I be the online pastor? He goes, oh, you're smart. You'll figure it out. So he had to figure it out. And he thought, well, what if I was the pastor of a small local church? How would I treat people? And he took all of his relational principles and applied them to online, and of course reached tens of thousands a week with that, which is really good. But a lot of churches see digital as cold and impersonal. And I love what you're saying about, yeah, well, actually put a human behind it and let them know what her name is, what his name is, and treat them as humans.
I tell you the other thing that I've noticed, I've realized as well, is when we think of the arc of our churches, we know that the Sunday experience isn't the only thing. There are all kinds of programs and resources. And so I think sometimes in this moment, we obviously we've wanted to make Sunday work, but there's also that midweek vibe in terms of I've seen where pastors or members of staff have got on a Facebook Live or an Instagram Live and have sought to foster community in those kinds of contexts where everybody has access to, because most people, the vast majority of people had a Facebook account or an Instagram account, and so it was these soft touches and different sizes of church gathering that proved equally important. And I think it hit me. I spent the last year having tea with people on Instagram and Facebook and I can't even remember how the idea came, except that, it's tea and I'm a Brit. And what struck me, and it was very informal, because I'm not technologically savvy, but I was struck by the stories that would come through the feed and how people began to connect and become friends. And I realized, I wonder whether in our pursuit to do this right, like you said, some of the simple relational things, people just wanted to have a cup of tea with somebody. You wanted to have
Did you do that like as an Instagram Live, or?
Yeah, I did it as an Instagram Live and Facebook. And I'd love to say I used some useful streaming device. I literally hooked my phone onto my laptop and would just meet with people. And I met a lot of caregivers who are like, we have been doing this for a while and we've been waiting for someone to come and talk to us, because they have been looking after parents and looking after children and looking after young adults in particular ways, or people who did shift work. And it's fascinating. The church has been out there and this has provided opportunity for us to be people where they are as well in different ways. So I'd encourage us to think through some of those things. And say, you might just bring your cup of coffee and it will feel weird, but it will foster this ongoing community because people have been isolated for a long time.
I'm so glad you shared that, because so much of social media, we innovated for about 2 months during lockdown. And then almost immediately it snapped back to the churches I follow, the leaders I follow. Join me on Sunday. Join me on Sunday. Hey, here's what happened on Sunday. Here's what happened on Sunday. Like the midweek social ministry is not really ministry. It's just like, get to Sunday. It's all about that hour on Sunday. So let's think about in-person gatherings. I think every church leader is realizing, okay, we're not going back to where it was in 2019. People are rethinking. A handful of churches are growing, which is awesome, and they have real space issues. What do you think some of the trends are for physical space as we gather? Do you think that this emphasis on community will require some innovation on churches, like smaller space or more intimate spaces for relational connection? Any thoughts on that?
I think my initial observations as I've begun to go to places again is realizing, though in different parts of the country, people are happy to meet with one another again. People are not entirely always comfortable. And so we've had to still think through social distancing. We've had to still think through what makes it comfortable, because it's after being isolated for this long, on one level you'd think people will be running back in the building and they're like, oh wait, hold on a second, I've not done this for over a year. I've not done this, and suddenly I'm with huge groups. And so I do think we will need to consider what does it look like to create spaces where what does our lobbies, foyers, whatever the language you use for their entryway look like? And how does it help people gather in ways which aren't crushed, but help them see people face to face in some way? What does welcome look like? Because welcome will be really important for our gathering spaces again, particularly if people who we've drawn and connected with online do decide that, you said it was a door. Supposing they decide to enter through the doorway. We can't have business as usual on that. What does even that part of welcome look like? I think we will have to think through how we sit. How we have rooms that maybe have space for groups of 5 or 20 or more. And in many ways, we've begun to think about that when all of us started using coffee shops for everything.
Yeah.
And we've begun to think about that. But I think we will. What does it look like to have some room? I know of certain churches that are multiplying their services, not because they've grown, but also people are glad for the growth, but feel edgy with the number of people in the room.
Well, it's so weird. It's so checkerboard. We're still under a mask mandate where I live, north of Toronto, which is fine. I mean, that's just the way it is. But when we were in Maine, there was no mask mandate and everyone had to make up their own rules. So I stupidly assumed that people would just take their masks off. It's like, I don't have to wear it. That's not what happened. Is some of the stores where we ask that you wear a mask. Others had, if you're double vaccinated, you can come in. Well, nobody's checking at the door, so who knows what that means. And I found that a shocking number of people were still wearing masks when masks weren't required. Now, that's older folks, et cetera, vulnerable people with, who are immunocompromised. And on the other hand, you got sports arenas filled with 50,000 people, back to back, shoulder to shoulder, breathing all over each other. So, and what pastors have found, I don't know whether you've seen this or not, is that people seem to be ready to go back to certain parts of their life, but not necessarily to church.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Definitely. And I think some of that may be to do with some of the polarization you spoke of earlier as well. And that it's like, this is tense. It's one thing if you're in a grocery store and somebody's wearing a mask and somebody isn't. It's another thing when it's kind of like, oh, we're people now. we're journeying together now. And so I think there is that combination of I'm not sure how to be, but I don't know whether I've got the energy for some of the challenging conversations that this might mean as well in practice. I remember I have a platform of women leaders that I coach, and I remember asking them what were some of the biggest challenges, and they said it's still how we all talk about masks. And they said they were surprised that was as tight as it was and as vulnerable as it was. But they said people are spent, people are tired, people are weary, but here we are. So I can also see why, I mean, there is also the element of, I do quite like brunch on a Sunday. Brunch turned out to be quite nice. And that, but I think there is also some of those places may feel easier than to go deep with some of the church stuff right now.
It feels a little bit like the ageless argument of, well, I don't have money to tithe, but I've got money for a new car and I've got money for Disney Plus and Netflix. But, it's one of those things where I'm not comfortable going back to church, but I will go to brunch and I will go to a arena and watch my favorite team play. So, Joe, you've got a huge ministry to women. And while I got you, I want to ask you, how have women been uniquely impacted by the pandemic? Or have they been uniquely? I don't want to make an assumption in the question, but how would you say they've been impacted?
I mean, I think it's been fascinating looking at the emerging data about women around the world as well. Oxfam International, they said that that COVID-19 cost women $800 billion in earnings. That is the combined figure of the combined GDP of 98 countries.
Holy cow. That's a unique impact on women.
Yeah, that's Oxfam International describing that. And then they said it was a conservative estimate because it hadn't included domestic workers and garment workers.
Right.
As well. So there's a shuddering there. I think it was the World Economic Forum who, when they look at their pillars for equality, they've said that what they call the COVID-19 effect has amplified the gender gap, setting women back a generation. And I think they span a generation as 36 to 40 years, something like that.
Wow.
And so that's some of the kind of big global data that we're seeing.
And what's under that? Is that a caregiver role? Is that a part-time worker thing? Do you know what's under that?
What's under
under the setback?
The setback, I think it's a combination of the realities of work and things closing, caregiving role, caregiver, teacher. I don't know if you read an article near the end of last year of the New York Times. They called the Primal Scream. And it was
I did not see that. No.
Mothers. It was the stories of working mothers. And I mean, the title said it all in terms of the Primal Scream. Every time I would say this to women, they'd be like, yeah, you don't even need to tell me the article now, because it was the pressure of taking care of parents at a distance who are lonely and isolated, taking care of children, all of us suddenly becoming teachers, men and women becoming teachers of our elementary school kids, middle school kids, high school kids, college kids at this time, navigating that whilst trying to hold down a job, whilst knowing that we're just the chronic uncertainty that we've all lived with, but having this disproportionate impact as well within our jobs. Again, I think it was Forbes who called the economic impact of COVID. They said that in 2008, it was called the he session because it disproportionately impacted jobs that were traditionally inhabited by men. But at this era, they've been calling it the she session because of the industries distinctly impacted have been disproportionately concerned roles that women traditionally inhabited. And so I think there's an employment issue. There is a caregiving issue. There is, we're talking, when we look at our current moment and what's being described as the great reassessment or the great resignation, well, that happens at a childcare facility. Well, that has a boom impact on your job, because if you don't have anybody who's able or willing to staff that area, what does that mean for you going back to work? Because you've come to rely on that as part of your getting back into the workplace. And there are many women who aren't working, but there are a significant amount who are. That's the reality of our world. And so there is and I remember talking to one woman business leader who in retail, and she said, she was just talking about the impact of furloughing staff and things like that, and then said, I think our next crisis is the mental health crisis on how we handle this.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for all of us, men and women. But again,
and childcare has been a huge issue. I know from some people close to me, with kids in school and COVID testing, daycares are opening and closing, and after school cares are opening and closing. And it's been super, super challenging, as well as the elimination of like part-time jobs, et cetera, et cetera. How can pastors and church leaders who are listening practically, like what can we do to help support the unique needs of women in their churches?
Yeah. And I really would encourage, I think one of our leadership roles is by listening and to say, because there is some contextualization, isn't there? Different parts of the country, different parts of the world, that handle childcare differently. And so I would say one of the first things we could do is spend time listening to the women in our community, the single women, the different generations, and say, okay, tell me your story. What's the story of your experience this year? Because we'll hear things, but we'll hear some distinctions about where the greatest pressure points are. So our church, for a while, I want to say maybe the earliest days of what we understood as the pandemic, had a kind of back to school kind of work ministry that they set aside. A number of the community were qualified teachers, and so it was, how can we help kids because they're missing, because they're being rolled back in terms of what they're learning and what they have access to learning. How can we support our church family by there? I know that you wouldn't say you're a teacher. You chose not to be a teacher for a reason, and here you are. But there are teachers who are part of this church family who will come alongside your kids and who will come alongside the community. That's a massive mission field right now.
That's so good.
Huge. When we think of the whole area of childcare and support, what can we be providing? What's feasible? What's realistic with our spaces? How do we partner with the local community in that area? Because those things are huge. What does it look like to support back to work, resume building, some real practical things that can help people who have lost jobs, resume building, helping them work on networks and connections, knowing what's available. We know there are jobs, but we know there's lots of loss as well. How do we make connections there? Those things could help families in significant ways.
Oh, that's so good. I love how you started by, how about listening? Like, you didn't say it that way, but you're right, because often we just sit there behind a desk, and it's often men who just make decisions and go, well, I think what we need is. But as any business leader will tell you, one of the best things you can do is try to figure out where the pain is, and then see how you are uniquely equipped to help people with it, and then to assist them. And, in my limited experience, this is anecdotal, not statistical, young families are hesitant to come back.
Yeah.
Because of the unvaccinated status of children, whatever you think about vaccines. And I don't want my kids to get sick. And they're already in school 5 days a week. So why are we going to add a sixth day, to that mix and another group of kids? So this is super helpful. As we wrap up, any final thoughts you want to share with pastors who are listening?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's incredible that you have sustained yourselves in this time. Do you know, do you know what I mean? I think and I really want to encourage you in your work and in your service and in your ministry. And I hope that all the pastors here are getting the help they need as well, the sustenance they need. I would encourage us. I think Carey, you said something that struck me as well, that we were really about the work of innovation for the first couple of months, and then it's like, oh gosh. But as this thing drags on and on, I'm looking at 2022 and thinking, are you going to be the normal member of the family of the 2020s, or are you going to come with a different kind of freak flag?
You're going to be another weirdo.
Are you going to be another weirdo? And so I would encourage us. I would encourage us that I think that lead by listening is huge right now, to keep on listening to the heartbeats of our communities, the pressure points, and as we seek to rebuild or restructure, to keep those voices, keep hearing those voices, because we can listen for a moment and then still run ahead, when actually we probably need, it may feel like we're slowing down, but if we're slowing down to build well, it's worth it. If we're slowing down and listening well, to hear, because I can't get away from the fact that this era is not a surprise to God.
Yeah.
And that he is still faithful. But now we are increasingly coming to terms with the fact that we're not bouncing back, but we're building into the future. Let's make sure we are hearing the voices of as many as wide a breadth of our community, both in the church and those we're seeking to reach, as we possibly can, because I believe God will speak to us through that.
Joe, thanks so much for being with us today. So appreciate you.
Thank you.
Well, I always appreciate conversations with Joe Saxton. Man, she's a great leader, and I always benefit from her insight, David, and things to keep on our radar screen as we move forward.
Yeah, I'm always looking for ways to work with her, and I'm so glad she was able to make some time for the interview today. What a great interview.
Mm-hmm. So if you want more about how you're rethinking space, how to create really relational space, both online and in real life, you may want to check out the incredible work of the Aspen Group. You can learn more at theaspengroup.com/ChurchPulse, and that's where you'll find the home for just about everything we're talking about. And this is part of a series too. We'll continue it next episode. David, looking forward to that.
Can't wait. Thanks so much for those who are listening and joining us, not only for this series, but who have been regular listeners to Church Pulse Weekly. We know how tired you are, how exhausted, how much you're searching for vision or for encouragement. And Carey and I are in your corner. It's been such a pleasure working with you, Carey, over these many months. And our friendship goes way before the pandemic, but it has only deepened in these months since the whole world seemed to tilt on its axis. And so we're so grateful to you as listeners. If you're just tuning in for the first time, like us or recommend it to others. It's been such a privilege for me here at Barna to be able to begin to translate some of the things that we're seeing and hearing in the research into your ears, not just in the books or the reports that we write, but also to sort of share with you some of the things we're learning, both in the interview with you, Carey, as well as in